Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to have a look at a Bach chorale. But we're going to have a look at one of the Bach chorales in which Bach notated the chorale melody that he had inherited as part of his work in the Lutheran Church. And this time he's written a bass with some figures underneath the bass line to indicate the chords. Now, this is a very typical Baroque practice. You have this thing called the figured bass, where you literally write a bass line and you put some numbers underneath that tell you what the chords are. Lots of you will be familiar with the figured bass. If you're not, don't worry, because I'll explain that in just a moment. But it's quite interesting that he's got quite a number of chorales. If you have the Riemann Schneider collection of chorales, for example, you'll find there's a whole set of these in the back, which is quite interesting. So I thought we'd look at one of these in this video just to see what he's done with the chorale melody that he's inherited, then by writing a bass line and putting the figures there. Why did the Baroque composers use this figured bass? It's a kind of musical shorthand. So instead of having to write out all the notes, you just write the bass line and you put some numbers, then the keyboard player would know how to find the chords, to realize the chords. That's the word that we use, realizing a figured bass. But this is interesting because it's a chorale that would have been intended to be sung for 4 voices. So it's possible that maybe just the top line would have sung this and a keyboard player would have filled in the harmony. It's possible that this would have been the basis for writing a full harmonization of the chorale. But first of all, let's just have a listen to what this would sound like if I play the chorale melody and the bass line and I realize the figures. It goes like this. Okay, so it sounds like a Bach chorale, and all I've done is a simple realization of the figures. Now, what I've played is something that works. It realizes the figures, but it would have been possible to have organized the parts in a different kind of way, or to embellish the parts a little bit more than I did. But I was just trying to give you a fairly straight realization of the figured bass. Now, if you're familiar with figured bass, forgive me for a moment while I just explain how this works, and then we'll come back and have a look at how you play from the figured bass, how you would write the notes into the score if you're trying to notate from a figured bass. So this is all based on the idea of intervals above the bass line, and it's very interesting in relation to Baroque thinking because it's telling us something about how Baroque composers thought, that much of their harmonic thinking was from the bass upwards. And we these days tend to think about melody downwards. So that's an interesting aspect of it. So all you do is you say, well, if the first note of this chorale is G, okay, and I want a G minor chord, say a tonic chord, I say, well, what are the intervals above the bass note? I've got G in the bass, B flat is 3 above the bass, D is 5 above the bass. So this is a 5-3 chord. So 5-3 effectively means that it's a root position chord, in this case based on G. If I put that in first inversion, so I have B flat in the bass, then with D and G, well, you see that D is 3 above the B flat and G is 6 above the B flat. So a first inversion chord ends up being a 6-3 chord. If I put it in second inversion, so I have D in the bass with G and B flat above it, well, G is 4 above the bass and B flat is 6 above the bass, so that's a 6-4 chord. Okay, so this takes care of all our basic diatonic chords. So 5-3 is always root position, and 6-3 is always first inversion, and 6-4 is always second inversion. Now, it's also true that we abbreviate these things. So when you have a root position chord, because there are more root position chords than any other chord, we know it's 5/3 and we just leave it blank. So if you see nothing at all, then that's a root position chord. If you see a 6, that is how we abbreviate 6/3. Okay, so 6 just means 6/3. You assume the 3 is there. And because 6/4, the second inversion, is the least often used of the basic triad positions, we write 6/4 in full. So when you look at this score now, you can see that this first chord here is a 5/3 chord. It's a root position chord. This one, this 6 chord, is a first inversion chord because that 6 means 6/3. Then we're coming back to a 5/3 chord. We're going on to a 6/3 chord and so on. So that accounts for most of what's going on. Now, if you want to have a 7th chord, well, then we've got to think about how to deal with them. So we're in the key of G minor, so let's think about a dominant 7th. So if I've got D, F sharp, A, C, okay, so this is 7th chords now. Let's just quickly work through what goes on with these. So what happens in 7th chords is 7, 5, 3 is a 7th chord in root position. So that's what I'm playing now, because above that D I've got 3, 5, 7, and we abbreviate that 7. It's kind of logical, isn't it? Because if 5/3 is abbreviated to blank, well, this is 7 blank, 7/5/3. So there's logic in that. As soon as I put this chord in first inversion, so I've got F sharp in the bass now with A, C, D. Can you see what I've now got? I've got 6, 5, 3, and that's the first inversion of a 7th chord. And we abbreviate that 6/5. So you can see, can't you, in this example, at the beginning of the second bar, there's a 6/5 chord. At the beginning of the last bar, there's a 6/5 chord. So we know that those are going to be 7th chords in first inversion. Okay, let's just move on. If I put this 7th chord in the next inversion, can you see what I've now got? I've got a 6, a 4, and a 3. So 6/4/3 is a second inversion 7th chord, and we abbreviate that 4/3. Now, trying to remember abbreviations could be a nuisance, but there's kind of logic in it. If you think about the first inversion, if it's 6/5/3 and I want to reduce that to 2 numbers, well, I can't call it 6/3 because that means it's an ordinary triad in first inversion. I can't call it 5/3 because that means it's an ordinary triad in root position. So all I can do is abbreviate 6/5/3 to 6/5. It's the only thing you can do. The second inversion, 6/4/3, I can't abbreviate it 6/3 because then that sort of looks like a first inversion triad. I can't abbreviate it 6/4 because then it looks like a second inversion triad. So if it's the second inversion of a 7th, the only thing I can do is abbreviate it 4/3. Okay, let's just look at the third inversion, the last inversion of the 7th chord. This time I've got 6/4/2. So 6/4/2 is the third inversion. Remembering with the 7th chord, you've got an extra note, so there is an extra inversion, and that abbreviates 4/2. So you can see what's going on with figured bass. If you see no figures at all, it's 5/3, a triad in root position. If you see 6, that's abbreviating 6/3, so it's the first inversion of an ordinary triad. If you see 6/4, that's the second inversion of an ordinary triad. If you see 7, that's abbreviating 753, so it's a 7th chord in root position. If you see 6-5, it's abbreviating 653, so that's the first inversion of a 7th chord. If you see 4-3, that's abbreviating 6-4-3, so that's the second inversion of a 7th chord. If you see 4-2, that's abbreviating 6-4-2, it's the third inversion of a 7th chord. Okay, a few other things just to notice. If you ever see an accidental sitting on its own, like there or here, that always refers to the third. So there's no numbers in this case, there's just sharp sign, could be a natural sign or a flat sign. If there's just an accidental, it's always talking about the third. You can sort of see this first one, can't you? Because if that sharp there in bar 2 on the second beat is saying the third above the bass D must be a sharp, well, we can see that's exactly what's happening in the given chorale melody. When we see this one at the end, we know that we need to put an F sharp somewhere in the harmony, in the alto or the tenor parts. Sometimes we have an accidental written alongside a number. So if you see this one, for example, on the penultimate chord, natural 5 is saying, well, the 5th above A is E, but it should be E flat because of the key signature. So if I want it to be E natural, I have to write natural 5. You might also notice, I'll just zoom this in a bit, that when we have this thing, there's a 6 with a slash through it. And when you see a slash through it, that literally means there is a chromatic alteration to that number. So often you'll see sharp 6, flat 6, natural 6, something like that. So, you know, for example, in the next chord, you see natural 5. So it's telling me that the 5th above this bass note is E, so it's going to be E natural. See, there's E flat in the key signature. So if Bach wants it to be E naturally, he writes natural 5. But if he puts that slash through a number, it just means it has a chromatic alteration. So you have to kind of work out what it is. And in this case, the 6 above the G is E, should be E flat. It's going to be E natural because we're heading to a different key on the approach to the cadence. Okay, I hope that all makes sense. So if I want to play this thing, let's go from the beginning. I've got a G in the chorale melody, I've got a G in the bass. And so I've got to fill in the middle, haven't I? It's a 5-3 chord. So 3, 5, that kind of gives me the chord, doesn't it? The next chord, I've got D in the melody, F sharp in the bass, and it says 6. So that's an abbreviation of 6-3. So what's 3 above that? A. What's 6 above it? D. So that's the chord I need there. And it confirms that it's a first inversion chord. Then I'm coming back to the original chord, but this time I've got B flat in the melody. And so I go on. The next chord is a 6 at the end of bar 1, so B flat in the bass, so 6 abbreviates 6-3. 3 is D, 6 is G. Okay, so I can put that chord down there. The next one is 6-5, so that's the first inversion of a 7th chord, so it's 6-5-3. So there's the bass, C. 3 is E flat, 5 is G, 6 is A. The next one just has a sharp sign above the D, so it's a 5-3 chord, but the sharp is saying sharpen the third. So it's D, the sharpened third, the raised third is F sharp, and the 5th is A. And so we go on. So you see how I'm beginning just to unpack those figures. Now, it's also quite useful to be able to convert these into Roman numerals for people who are more used to thinking in Roman numerals than they are in figured bass. So if the first chord is going to be a 5-3 chord, well, if it's a root position on G, must be called 1. The second chord's going to be a 6, so that's a 6-3, a first inversion. So if F sharp's in the bass, what's it the first inversion of? Chord 5. So it's a 5B or a 5-6 chord, depending on which side of the Atlantic Ocean you live. And then we're going back to a chord 1. And then hopefully if I just whiz through this, it will make sense. This one here is going to be a 2/7 in first inversion. So just because it says 6/5, we know it's the first inversion of a seventh, but then you've got to work out, well, which seventh? So if this is in first inversion with C in the base, well, the root must be a third below that, so it must be A. So you're in G minor. So that's a 2/7, isn't it? It's the seventh built on the supertonic note, but it's in first inversion. And the reason why we have a sharp in the next chord is because this is going to be the dominant chord, chord 5. So the leading note is raised, isn't it, in the harmonic minor scale. So that's 5. And then we've got 2 chord 1s. And then the next phrase starts with 1 again. And then look, we've got this F sharp again. So that's going back to 5 in first inversion, back to 1. And then we've got an interesting situation because on the next chord, we've got these 2 Ds at the end of bar 3. And you'd be thinking, well, if we're in G minor, why doesn't it say sharp? In other words, sharp 3 for an F sharp. So D, F sharp, A. Well, actually, he's modulating. So from this point onwards, he's thinking in the key of D minor. So that's why there's an F natural, because it's going to be 1 in D minor, which means that the previous chord, this one here, is our pivot chord, because that chord is 1 in G minor, but 4 in D minor. Okay, so let's carry on. Now we've got 6/5, so first inversion of a 7th chord, all right? But we've got 6 chromatically altered. That's because we're moving into D minor. So the 6/5 chord there means that this is a 2/7B in the key of D minor. Okay, the next chord. Now let's have a look at this. It's something to do with 5 with a 3 that's got a sharp sign on it. So if it's A, the 3 becomes C sharp. The E becomes E natural, and that, of course, is chord 5 in D minor. Okay, we come to the last chord and it says D. Well, if it's a 5/3 chord, it's going to be chord 1 in D minor, but that will be D, F, A, and he's using a TS to Picardy. So we've got this sharp third going on to make it a D major chord. So that's kind of how it converts. So one thing that's sort of quite fun to do, and some people will want to develop the skill, is actually, can you get to the point where you can read the figured bass? Can you switch between figured bass and Roman numerals? That's quite a useful thing to do as well. And then as a written exercise, can you complete the middle parts? Well, I'm going to do that as quickly as I can, just to give you an idea. Well, if we were completing this from the figures, what might it look like? And I'm only saying this is what it might look like because there's more than one way of doing it. But what I'm just trying to do now fairly quickly is to complete these parts in accordance with the figures. Okay. And you might well have other ideas as to how this could be done. But here's one possibility, that's all I'm saying. Okay. Now, I've just done that very quickly on the hoof, but I think that is all going to work fairly well. So the result of this would be this. Now, it's unlikely that Bach would have been quite so plain with it, so he may have added a few interesting kind of passing notes, passing tones, and just embellish things a little bit. But that's the basic harmony. And of course, it would be perfectly reasonable to include some embellishment of that. But it's interesting to see that some of these chorales were written with just the chorale melody and the bass line with the figures. And hopefully this particular exercise has just given you a chance to see, well, what do these figures mean? What's the figured bass all about? What are the principles of it? And if you understand what I've explained about a figured bass, that really gets you into most of what you need to know about realizing a figured bass. Then there's a great challenge for keyboard players just to think, well, can I realize the figured bass? But also to all of us, can we convert between figured bass and Roman numerals? Can we write the harmony from the figured bass as well as from the Roman numerals? And all of that gives us an insight into Baroque thinking.